Good morning, everybody. Try that one more time. Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much. How are you guys enjoying the Tech Ed? Are you having a good Tech Ed? Good time in Barcelona? Nice city to visit. For most of us are visiting, I'm assuming. As you can tell, I'm visiting from the United States. My name's John Flanders. I'm an instructor, an independent consultant with a company called Pluralsight. I'm also a BizTalk MVP, and I work a lot with the BizTalk team at Microsoft. By the way, as a side note, if you go down to the expo hall after the session, Pluralsight has a booth there, and we've got some t-shirts left over. In fact, I have the t-shirt on underneath this shirt, but I don't think I can undo it with the microphone. But it has a Silverlight symbol on it, a light bulb with AG inside of it, so it's a Silverlight t-shirt. It's not a BizTalk t-shirt, but it's still kind of a cool conference t-shirt. So if you go down there and give them the secret password, they'll give you a t-shirt, and the secret password is BAM, right? So go down to the Pluralsight booth after the session if you want to get a free t-shirt. So we're going to go ahead and talk about BAM, Business Activity Monitoring. We're going to talk about it a little bit in general, and then we're going to talk specifically about how to use it with services in BizTalk Server 2006 R2. Oops. And I clearly don't know how to use this clicker correctly. There we go. So in terms of what we expect that you know for this session, not a lot, just a little bit of knowledge about BizTalk Server, a little bit of knowledge about .NET programming, and a little bit of knowledge about XML, because we're going to be looking at all three of those things. Now, just so I can get a handle on where everybody is in terms of experience, how many people are using BizTalk Server or are familiar with BizTalk Server? Okay, so we've got a crowd of basically the faithful here. Of those people that are using BizTalk Server, how many people are using BAM today, Business Activity Monitoring? Okay, that's about a typical percentage. That's a little bit, probably around 10 to 15, maybe upwards of 20%. And that's pretty typical for most crowds where I do a talk on BAM. What we're going to talk about again is we're going to talk about using Business Activity Monitoring. Now, a lot of you are using BizTalk. I know some of you aren't, so we'll try to talk a little bit about what BizTalk is about. We'll talk a little bit about what BAM is about in general, and then we're going to look specifically again at this new feature in BizTalk Server 2006 R2, which is a pretty long phrase, so I will try to shorten that for the rest of the time to R2. So if I just say R2, that means BizTalk Server 2006 R2, which is the version of BizTalk Server that just released in September. And we're going to talk about the BAM interceptor and how to use that to intercept data inside of WCF, or Windows Communication Foundation. Now, how many people are using WCF today? Okay, fair number. That's pretty impressive. That's more than normal in a group like this. So we're going to talk about the integration between WCF and BizTalk Server, and we're going to talk about how to use this BAM interceptor and what we could use it for. So BAM, again, is a part of BizTalk Server. It stands for Business Activity Monitoring. And I'm going to kind of come down here because this isn't an interactive session per se, but it's Friday morning. In fact, thank you guys very much for coming out on Friday morning at 9 a.m. Wow, that's impressive. I was expecting a much smaller crowd, so I appreciate all of you coming out to hear me talk and to listen to me talk about BAM. So what is BAM about? Business Activity Monitoring, of course, is a generic term that could apply to any application or any product where they give you the facility to be able to find out what's happening inside of your processes. So activity monitoring is monitoring what's happening inside of your applications, what's happening inside of your business processes, and having that data surface in some way through some sort of reporting tool, through alerts, through a spreadsheet, through a web page, through SharePoint. Doesn't really matter how it ends up surfacing. It ends up surfacing somehow and allowing people to see what's happening inside of your processes. Now, a lot of people, when they look at BAM, they go, well, you know, why do I want to use this thing called BAM? I have this data warehouse. I have a data mart. I have an ERP system. Those systems are all my systems of record. And so I can tell what happened inside of a business process by looking at my system of record, looking at my data store of record. And that's absolutely true. And BAM doesn't pretend to be your official data store of record. This is one place where when people are looking at BAM, they kind of go, oh, I'm not sure about doing this. But you have to remember exactly what particular functionality this part of BizTalk server or any process server is supposed to fulfill. It's supposed to fulfill exactly what the slide says, which is in-flight visibility. Your systems of record, your data warehouse, your ERP system, those systems aren't updated necessarily as the process is happening. Those systems are generally updated at the end of the process. Now, sometimes that's not true. Sometimes you have a process that updates a state table or a staging table or something like that. But a lot of people's processes, they have these pieces of code or orchestrations in the case of BizTalk or whatever that the case may be, workflows. And they're processing your application, processing orders, for example. We can take the canonical order processing example. And at the end of that process, once the order has all been sort of settled, well, yeah, you absolutely are going to go to your data warehouse, your ERP system, whatever the final system of record is, and that's where you're going to find out what actually happened. Okay? BAM is about what's happening, right? BAM is about what's going on right now, not at the end of your process, but at the very beginning of your process, and while that process is executing. And that's why you need an infrastructure like the one that's built into BizTalk Server, because the infrastructure built into BizTalk Server, again, known as BAM, the generic term, we also use that to refer to that part of BizTalk Server, is especially for that, right? It's especially for allowing you to be able to get in-flight business data and be able to get that data out to the people who need to see it. Now, that word business I used, and it's obviously part of the acronym, the typical use case for BAM is for getting data out to the business users, getting the data out to the business owners, to the CTOs, to the CFOs, to the accountants, the people who want to know what's happening inside the process from a business point of view. And it definitely is geared towards that. But I have found people, and I also advocate using BAM as a way to get out operational data, data about what's happening inside of your processes, not necessarily geared towards what the business users want, although, again, it's very powerful and useful in that scenario, but also for getting out what we as developers want to know. We want to know things like, how long is this process taking? How long is each part of the process taking? How long is the call to service X taking? How many times a day are we getting hit? How many requests are we processing every hour or every 5 hours or every day? And those kinds of pieces of information are very similar to the kinds of things I was talking about a minute ago, because they're in flight, right? They're things that are happening in your process right now as your process is executing. And so you're going to want some sort of system to pull those out. Now, what a lot of people do to get that information out of their applications is to use what I call declarative logging. Declarative logging would be, for example, using the Microsoft application logging block. Does anybody use that in their applications? Just a couple people, okay? That's fewer than normal. There's Log4Net. There are open source and proprietary for sale solutions. But all of them revolve around the idea that if I'm trying to figure out what's happening inside of my application from an operational point of view, what I've got to do is I've got to write code. That's actually, I think that that slide is wrong. Actually, let's fix this slide. Nobody pointed that out to me until now. I just noticed that this slide is wrong, right? Declarative logging, what I want to say here is imperative logging. Oops, no, wrong slide. That's the right one. Imperative. Yeah, imperative logging is evil. You give these slides to people and everybody looks them over and, there we go. That's a better slide. Imperative logging. This is what I call imperative logging. So this is, I have to go in and write code. So if you've never used the Microsoft application logging block or Log4Net or any of those kinds of tools, basically they require that at the top of my method, I have some code. C#, VB.NET, doesn't matter. Java, same thing, right? Doesn't matter what language you're writing in. It's a matter of I'm putting into my source code that's specifically for operational logging, for here's the start of my method, here's the end of my method. Microsoft does this in all of its libraries, right? If you turn on certain trace switches when you're using certain libraries from Microsoft, they'll start pumping out logging data out to a file or to the event log or to a database, depending on the trace listener that you've installed. And all of these things work in a very similar manner. And the key point is, and why I say it's evil, and that's just being sort of dramatic, just to sort of wake everybody up, right? Imperative logging is evil because it requires you to write code. Now, what are the problems with writing code? Right? What could happen if I have a logging system in my application and it requires me to write code? What are the downsides of that? As I said, we're going to do a little bit of an interactive session, even though it's not officially an interactive session. Anybody? What's that? I'm sorry, I couldn't hear the first word. Bugs from the logging code. Yeah, what if I write my logging code wrong? What if I forget to write my logging code, right? I've got to do code reviews of all the code of all the developers that work in my system, make sure that they dutifully put the logging code at the beginning of the method, at the end of the method, that they have try-catch blocks, and inside of the catch blocks, they're catching exceptions and logging those. I have to make sure that they did it all right, and there could be bugs in it, or it could have just forgotten to do it. I see this when I go to clients. I've seen this a lot lately. I go to clients and I look at their code, and at the beginning of the method, there's their logging code. In the catch block of their exception handlers, there's their logging code. And at the end of each method, there's the end logging code, which is good. It's good that they're trying to get some sort of instrumentation and information out of their systems. But I have a moral issue with using the imperative method because of the issue that we talked about, right? You could forget to write the code, you could write it wrong, and there could be bugs. What happens in a production system then when you need to change that logging code? If I did deploy an assembly, for example, and I did forget to add my logging code, or it has a bug, what do I have to do to make a change in order to get different logging out of my system? Redeploy, recompile, redeploy, stop everything, start everything, right? It's a big pain, okay? So that's why I'm not in favor of writing code. All of the different systems that you might use, I'm not, criticizing any particular one of them. I'm criticizing and saying what we should strive for in our systems is we should strive for some sort of declarative logging, some sort of system where we can basically apply configuration to our systems and then get those systems to pump out operational data without having to write code, without having to recompile, without having to redeploy, right? I think this is a much better system. Now, we have to take this idea that I'm talking about and put it in context of today's world, right? Today's world is all about services, right? We talk a lot about service-oriented architecture or building service-oriented systems. So, whatever your, the way you like to think about that is, that's the way that the industry is moving. A lot of the sessions here this week, right? Software plus services, and I'm sure they talked about it in the keynote, right? It's a big push today to have your systems, your applications be these disconnected autonomous services that then are somehow composed by some other part of your system or used by different parts of your system. And that means we're moving to a more of a distributed environment, a less manageable environment. And if you think about, if I build a set of services today with WCF, and let's say that I scale those services out to 4 or 5 or even 2 to 5, right, 10, however many servers you might need to deploy to handle that service, well, then you have to multiply the effort of the imperative logging out to all those machines, right? Not only do I have to recompile and redeploy to one machine, but I might have to recompile and then deploy to multiple machines. And again, this is not something that I think any of us really want to do, right? We'd much rather, I think, agree it would be better to have a system where we could just create a piece of configuration, apply that configuration in sort of an aspect-oriented way, and get the system that we apply the configuration to pump data back to us so we can see what's happening inside of that system. The advantages to such a system are many, right? One of the advantages I've already talked about, right? I don't have to compile. I don't have to deploy. That's good for the initial release? What happens if I do decide to change the way the logging happens? What if I want more data? Or what if I want less data? What if I want to monitor only when I'm concerned about performance issues or I'm concerned about potential exceptions? But I'd like to have logging turned off the whole rest of the time because there is some performance impact to logging, whatever kind of logging system you use. There's some performance impact to doing that logging. So if you're really going for low latency kind of scenarios, you might want to turn that off. So having this kind of system where we've got a way to say, here's the data that we want to know about from our systems, some configuration that allows those systems or services to push the data into the data store, and then some way to get the data out, I think that's a pretty interesting system for using building an operational sort of data store, an operational management system. And that's really what BAM can do. Now again, if we go back a minute and just talk about BAM in general, BAM does stand for Business Activity Monitoring. So again, that's sort of, again, business-oriented, right? The idea is for BAM, the reason that they built it was to allow business users to get data out of BizTalk server about the processes that are going on. And I've been told this. I never personally sell BizTalk server, right? I'm a consultant, but when I go in, they've generally already bought BizTalk server, and they just want some help with figuring out a particular part of the system. So I never go on in the initial, hey, customer, you need BizTalk server. What I've been told by people who do that, though, is that BAM is an excellent selling point. And the reason BAM's an excellent selling point is it's something that the business users actually can see. All of the rest of the parts of BizTalk server are very powerful. The scaling out to multiple systems, the pub subsystem, which allows us to have disconnected messaging, and the business rules. Those are all great things for us as developers when we're building a system. The adapters and pipelines and maps, schemas. You can't go into a CIO and say, hey, look at this visual schema editor. Isn't this going to be great for our developers? Right? Very few CIOs are going to care about that. But if you show them BizTalk, and then you show them a BizTalk application that's instrumented using BAM from a business point of view, and then you show them how they're going to get that data out every day, right? That's pretty compelling. So BAM is a underutilized part of BizTalk. Notice, if you guys noticed at the beginning of the talk, I asked how many people were using BizTalk. The vast majority of the audience said, yes, we're using BizTalk. A few people said we're using BAM. Not everybody said they're using BAM. To me, whoops, that is not a good thing. I think every single BizTalk application should be using BAM. And I have yet to find a very compelling reason why somebody shouldn't use BAM. But there are some reasons why people don't use BAM. Has anybody in the audience used BizTalk, looked at BAM, and then said, no, I don't think I want to use BAM for this system? You have? You want to share the reasons why? Yes. That is probably the #1 response, which is, I understand what BAM does, and it sounds really good, but I don't understand how it works, and it takes a long time to figure out how it works. And this is a side effect of the tooling, okay? We'll just get it out up front today. The BAM tooling story is not very good. The BAM runtime story, I think, is fairly amazing. I'm impressed with the BAM infrastructure in terms of what it can do for us as developers in a BizTalk or now WCF or WF system when we're talking about R2. We'll get to that in a minute. But it is sort of very difficult to know what's happening in BAM and to know how to use it. So hopefully today's talk, as I go through and do a demo in a couple minutes, hopefully that will help a little bit, okay? But I agree, that's the number one use case, which is, I don't really understand how I'm supposed to use this. There's multiple tools. You have to go into Excel. You have to do this and that. And it's sort of disconnected. There's no one tool. And it's not easy to use. Once you get it up and running, people are generally happy with it, okay? Okay, so a little bit more about BAM and the infrastructure for those of you that haven't used it. So it's part of BizTalk Server, right? If you buy BizTalk Server, you get BAM, which is why I say if you have BizTalk Server, you should be using BAM. There's really no compelling reasons not to be using BAM. It's an infrastructure for doing exactly what I've been talking about, right? I've been talking about how do we create a system where we've got a data store that can store the information we want to know about our in-flight system, what's happening inside of that system. How can we configure our application to push data into that system? And that's really what BAM is, right? BAM is about creating an observation model, which is, what are the pieces of data that I want to know about my running system? Creating a configuration that allows BizTalk Server or other systems to push the data into BAM and then allow us to view that data. Now, the way that they do that in this version of BAM is when I create what's called a BAM activity, which I'll show you in a minute how we could do that, and I'll show you examples of BAM activities as we go along. What happens is they create an infrastructure inside of a SQL Server table, the BAM primary import database, and a set of stored procedures and infrastructure for pushing data into BAM. But what we really care about in terms of that infrastructure is the views. So there's database views that we can pull out and look at and report on. Now, out of the box, they have a reporting portal. This is called the BAM portal. Now, this is another thing that people say when they say, when I ask the question, why haven't you used BAM? They say, well, that BAM portal, it's just, yeah, it's okay. It has some query capabilities. You can save the queries, but you have to save them as XML files on your local machine. There's no way to distribute queries to multiple users. It has a pivot table view. This is another important piece of BAM. Not only do they have the ability to store your raw data about your processes, but they also have the facility to create aggregations on top of that raw data and expose that aggregations to you through the reporting or through the database. There are two kinds of aggregations. There's one called real-time aggregation, and then there's one that are called scheduled aggregations. The real-time aggregations are essentially cubes, but they are mocked up inside of SQL Server relational tables. This is another mistake that some people use or do, is when I ask the question, why aren't you using BAM? Some people say, well, the performance of BAM is not very good. And then I immediately ask them the question, well, are you using real-time aggregations? And the answer to that is always yes. And real-time aggregations, yes, are an incredible performance drain on your system. You don't want to use them. And in fact, the documentation says real-time aggregations are really for testing, for your testing systems, not for your production system. So for your real systems, you want to turn off real-time aggregation, turn on the scheduled aggregation, which schedules a DTS or SSIS package to push the raw data into a cube inside of SQL Server Analysis Services. And then, of course, you can report on that cube. There are plenty of reporting tools for reporting on data. The BAM portal, again, the way you should think about that is you should think about it as a testing tool. The BAM portal is your testing tool for seeing whether your BAM infrastructure is working, whether it looks the way that you want it to look. But you never want to give the BAM portal to the end user. Okay, BAM portal is okay for developers and for IT pros, for operational people. It's not for business users. Okay, don't put the BAM portal in front of the business user because they'll look at it and go, this is BAM, this is, this is not good. Why do we want this? So again, the BAM portal falls into that category of tools that they didn't really just, complete and make great, right? They made the infrastructure, they spent all their time and energy on the infrastructure, and they didn't spend much time on the tools. So for reporting, you can use things like, I don't know, SQL Server reporting services, Crystal Reports, ASP.NET and the grid view. Performance Point is one that just came out from Microsoft, which is like dashboards that you can deploy to SharePoint. So there's lots of reporting options, and they also have alert capability. So for example, you could say, if an order over €1 million comes into our system, send an alert to the sales manager because they're going to want to know about that order. So they have alert capability as well, okay? So how do we do this in BAM? Well, what we do first is we sit down and say, what is the data that we want to know about this process? And we call that an activity, okay? So a BAM activity is a set of data points, checkpoints, whatever you want to think, whatever you want to call them. They are going to be textual data, integer data, decimal data, or date-time data. And you can go into Excel and create, this is one of the tools, the BAM activity creation tool is in Excel. And you go into Excel and say, I want to create a BAM activity. And here are the activities that I want to create. And what happens is, underneath the covers, and when I first discovered this, this is when BAM started to make a little bit more sense to me. The gentleman said, I don't really understand what BAM does. Well, when you take an activity definition and deploy it to the BAM infrastructure, it creates a table, right? Think about the data points that you want to know about for a particular business process. It creates a table, and each of the columns represents one of the checkpoints that you've specified in the activity. When that activity, when your process runs, it puts data into a row of that database, and that's BAM. Now, you might say, well, I can create a table, right? I can write code that puts data into a table, and that's absolutely true. The whole point of BAM and the activity definition, though, is that it makes your observation model potentially dynamic, right? The BAM infrastructure supports the concept of redeploying an activity, taking away columns, adding columns, changing your configuration for your observation model. It's a dynamic infrastructure. So it's in-flight, business visibility, dynamic infrastructure, and declarative tracking, right? Those are the key points of why BAM is, I think, a more powerful, better system to use than to use, let's say, the Microsoft application logging block, creating your own tables and writing your own SQL code that puts data into those tables. That's why I prefer BAM, because of the potential that the infrastructure gives me in terms of I can change the activities, I can change my mapping from my activities to my physical processes, and I can deploy this all globally and without having to restart any particular piece of my infrastructure. I don't have to go out and stop everything and recompile and redeploy. I just go change the configuration, and I'll show you that in a minute. Okay? Now, the database table part, they could change this in a future version. And in fact, how many people paid attention at all to last week? Last week, they had a conference in Redmond. The BizTalk team sponsored this conference, the Connected Systems Division. And they announced a new initiative called Oslo. How many people heard about that? A fair number of you. Okay, if you didn't hear about that, I recommend going out and using your favorite search engine and searching Oslo Microsoft. And actually, you can go to microsoft.com/SOA, and it will show you a lot of information about the Oslo initiative. This is just going to get more and more important, right? The point I'm trying to make is this concept of declarative tracking and declarative configuration of your tracking, both from an operational and a business point of view, is going to get more important. In fact, the demo they showed last week had that capability as one of the things that they talked about. Another thing that I like to tell people about BAM, because a lot of people go, well, you know, if I invest in BAM now, is that going to really pay off for me in the long run with Microsoft? You know, I can't, I mean, some people say, and I've said this myself, I can't believe with how little they've put into the tools that they really mean for us to take this thing seriously. But I can tell you, I think that they do mean for us to take it seriously. The Oslo example is one example why. Anybody doing EDI with BizTalk Server 2006 R2? A couple of people. The EDI subsystem, which is a new subsystem in R2, uses BAM for all of its reporting. Okay? So they didn't create a whole new set of EDI reporting tables. They didn't use the out-of-box tracking database from BizTalk to store tracking information for EDI. They're using BAM. BAM is the way that the EDI infrastructure is pushing out tracking information from the EDI subsystem. So I think if you take those two things and think about what that means in terms of their investments, I think that you can see that Microsoft is actually pretty serious about BAM. So a checkpoint is, again, just a piece of data that we want to know about our running process. And again, it could be any of those 4 data types, and that's slightly limited, but the string data type takes care of most things. And basically, a checkpoint is just a name. You say, here, I want a checkpoint, and you specify what that checkpoint name is. And in fact, let's switch over now to my demo machine. And what I've got up on the screen is Microsoft Excel, Excel 2007. They've made some improvements to BAM in R2. One of the improvements is that the BAM add-in for Excel now works in Office 2007. If I want to create a BAM activity, what I do is I say, here's a new BAM activity. I'll say new activity. I'll give it an activity name, like hello, tech ed, Tamiya. And then I go through and say, I want a new item. When I say new item, that's creating one of these checkpoints, which again is just a piece of data that I want to know. So going through this wizard is just a matter of saying, what is the process that I want to instrument? What are the pieces of information I want to know about that process? And you just go through one by one and specify what you want the names of those pieces of information to be, what you want the data types to be. And at the end, what you've got is an activity definition that then can be deployed and used inside of BAM. Make sense? Okay. We'll have some time for the questions at the end, but if you feel like you want to ask a question during the session, that's okay with me as well. So we're going to go through and do this. Now, the key point of this activity definition, we talk about in-flight visibility. We talk about your systems and how your systems are built today. Again, most people are building systems in a disconnected, service-oriented way. So the key point about BAM and BAM activity is that it can span multiple physical processes, right? It should be a definition which is a more logical definition for what you want to know about your process. It doesn't have to tie into any particular physical component. And in fact, when you use BAM in that more abstract way, you're almost always going to end up being better off. So the idea is you're going to sit down with the business owner, or if you're doing operational data, you're going to be the business owner yourself, or you're going to sit down with your team and you're going to figure out what are the pieces of information we want to know about a particular process. For every BizTalk installation, every BizTalk application, I always recommend using BAM. And at the minimum, what you can do is you can say process start, business milestone, process end, business milestone. And you're probably going to have some data. Let's say we're processing orders. So let's say we're processing and saying order amount, okay? And that actually probably wouldn't be an integer, right? It probably would be a decimal. If you just have those 3 checkpoints, that's pretty useful information to find out about any particular business process that you might have, right? How long does it take? What's the process start and process end? How many of them are we doing? And what's the total value, or what's an important piece of data from that process? And on top of this, we can build views. The views inside of the Excel experience turn into those cubes. So I talked about cubes and I talked about aggregation. So I could create a view even on top of this simple data, which would be things like, what's the average process time? How many are we doing a day? What's the total amounts? And then if you start to add more interesting data as part of your activity definitions, you can see that those cubes and that aggregation data could grow and be more interesting. Things like geographical information. You could drill down and up in the pivot table or the cube using the geographical information. Sales data, salespeople. Depending on what your potential problem is, there's a lot of pretty interesting things you can do. But if you just started with this and just applied this to every single one of your BizTalk applications, I think that would be pretty useful. So I always recommend to people who haven't used BAM and have BizTalk out there to just think about doing something simple like this and saying, I want to know when it starts, I know when it ends, and I want to know something important about the process. And then you can start building on top of that, because again, BAM is a dynamic infrastructure. Just because you start out with 3 checkpoints today doesn't mean that tomorrow or even this afternoon you could add additional checkpoints, reconfigure your installation, and then start getting out that additional data, okay? So I create a new activity, and when I press OK, it brings up the view creation wizard. Now you can actually press cancel here, right? It's totally legal to press cancel and say, I don't want any aggregations. I just want the raw data. Maybe you're going to build up the aggregations yourself. Maybe aggregations aren't important to you, and all you want is the raw data. So you can just say cancel and not create a view, or you could go through and create a view. Now, creating views and doing all that infrastructure is beyond the scope of this talk. We're really talking more about 2 things. What's the basic infrastructure of BAM and how does it work? And then how would I use BAM with BizTalk Server? And specifically, how would I use the R2 WCF interceptor? Because what we're going to do is after we create this activity and or views, and by the way, that's another key point. your base activity can have multiple views, and the views actually can be built on multiple activities. So your views can aggregate data from multiple activities. So again, it's a very powerful, flexible system. As I said, once I take this activity and deploy it into the BAM infrastructure, it's going to create a set of tables and stored procedures and views and allow me to start instrumenting my application using that activity. Now, the typical way that we do that is we use a tool called the Tracking Profile Editor. In BizTalk Server 2006 base, right, before R2, we had two interceptors. Okay, we had two interceptors for BAM and BizTalk. One was for orchestration. This is the one that's been around since 2004. So in 2004, all we had was the orchestration interceptor. And the way we configure the orchestration interceptor is by using this visual tool called the Tracking Profile Editor that I've got up on the screen. We open up our BAM activity, and that opens up on the tree view on the right. On the left, we open up our process, which is our orchestration designer rehosted inside of this editor. And to create our observation model configuration, our interceptor configuration for BizTalk orchestration, what we do is, we drag and drop, and I'll go ahead and I'll delete that one so we can do a little bit here. Drag and drop a shape onto the tree view and would say, okay, booking request, which is the first data point in this particular activity, that data is going to get filled in when the receive initial message shape executes. And so that's how we did the mapping. Okay, so for BizTalk Server 2006, we'd create our observation model, we deploy it into the BAM infrastructure that would create the necessary data store infrastructure for storing the activity data and potentially the views and all that other good stuff, the aggregation, scheduling, and all that stuff that it does behind the scenes. But to get actually the raw data in, what we do is we open the Tracking Profile Editor and we create our interceptor configuration. And we do that by dragging and dropping. And in 2006, they added the ability to do this with messaging. And at the end, what I do is I go to Tools and I'd say Apply Tracking Profile. And when I said Apply Tracking Profile, that would deploy the interceptor configuration for my messaging and or orchestrations to the BAM infrastructure. And again, in BizTalk, we talk a lot about having multiple machines. This is one of the advantages to BizTalk Server, is that we can scale it out by adding multiple machines to our BizTalk group. How many people have a multi-machine BizTalk installation? Almost everybody that runs BizTalk, right? So you know that this is what we do. And again, the idea here is I only have to do this once, right? I don't have to go to every machine that is running my orchestration and do this. I just do this once. It goes out to the global infrastructure for BAM, and then all the machines that are running inside of my BizTalk group pick up this configuration and start pushing data into my activity, and then everything else flows from that, right? Aggregations flow from that, reporting flows from that, but this is the basic way that we work with BAM, okay? So again, the idea is we create our observation model, the activity that we want to know, the data that we want to know about our processes. We create that in Excel. We create views, potentially, one or more views if we want aggregations. We take that file and we can either deploy the spreadsheet directly through the BAM configuration tool, the BAM management tool, or we can export XML from that Excel spreadsheet and deploy that into our infrastructure. Then we create our interceptor configuration, and this is the way we do it with BizTalk Server 2006. So I am going to show you a sort of a more full application. And in fact, I am running a multi-machine BizTalk installation up on the podium. In fact, I'm scared to pick it up very far, but I actually have a Mac Mini running Windows Server. I don't know if you knew that, but you can run Windows Server on a Mac Mini. It's obviously not supported by Apple or Microsoft, but it actually works. And I've got a virtual server on it where I've got 3 machines. One's my SQL Server, part of the BizTalk group, and then 2 BizTalk nodes. So I actually have a running BizTalk cluster or group up on the stage. And we're actually going to look at an application that's running on side of the BizTalk group, and we're going to go ahead and instrument it. Now, actually, I've already instrumented it from my business point of view, right? This is my business-oriented BAM activity, the one for this process, and it gets out the data that the business users want. Okay, so the business user helped me figure out what this BAM activity should be. I deployed it into infrastructure. Let me go ahead and run the application that, the front-end application that runs the BizTalk process on the back end. The scenario here is we're Northwind Music, right? We're always Northwind something when we're working with Microsoft. So we're Northwind Music. Northwind Music is a music conglomerate that has music studios all around the world. One of the things that we like to do is we like to make sure all our music studios are rented out to full capacity. So we've built a self-service portal that artists and producers can come to, pick a studio that they want to record some music in, hopefully some hit that makes them millions of dollars, and they can do that through our self-service portal. Now this self-service portal, if you're wondering what the Silverlight connection is actually this is built with Silverlight. So this is a Silverlight-based application hosted in ASP.NET with ASP.NET Ajax. And I can go through and I can go find the studio that I'm interested in. Say I'm interested in that studio. Right? If I hover over a studio, it gives me sort of a tooltip information about that studio. I go through and I pick what engineer that I want to be used inside of this studio. So I'll go ahead and drag and drop the engineer onto the studio image. Here's the equipment that I might want to use. So I want that microphone and I want this compressor. I pick my dates. So what dates do I want the studio from? Let's say, November 21st to, 24th. We're going to do a really quick recording. And when I click to reserve, it brings up a little confirmation sort of dialog here. And if I go ahead and say click to confirm, when I click to confirm, that actually is calling a WCF endpoint, okay? So R2 enables integration between WCF, Windows Communication Foundation, and BizTalk Server. So when I click that button to confirm, it's actually sending a WCF message to a WCF endpoint that's hosted inside of BizTalk Server. Once I send a message into BizTalk Server, that goes into the message box, and that starts my whole orchestration process, okay? Now, you already saw the orchestration in the tracking profile editor. Just so we have an understanding of the kind of thing that we're doing here, I'm going to pull up the orchestration designer in Visual Studio. And inside of Visual Studio, I'm just going to walk simply through what's happening here. What's happening is we're receiving the initial message, and then we're basically doing the provisioning process for this resource. So, this is kind of a fun Silverlight demo with a music studio. But you could think about this in terms of any sort of provisioning that you might need to do. So we need to provision the resources, the engineer. Can this engineer cover this particular reservation or not? Maybe they can, maybe they can't. Maybe we need some human intervention. So in the cases where we need human intervention, the process sends a message out to SharePoint. And then inside of SharePoint, the engineering manager can approve or disapprove or change the engineer if need be. And then that goes back into the BizTalk server process. Also the equipment. We don't own all that equipment. Sometimes we have to bring that equipment in from partners. So we have a service that goes out and talks to our partners and says, hey, we need this equipment for this particular date. Can you give it to us? And if it says yes, then it comes back and we continue the process. Then we need to get paid, right? Getting paid is the most important part of the process. So if it's a partner relationship we have with the producer or the label of the producer or the artist, we can just bill them directly. We've got, partner links set up essentially. We can talk directly to the partner systems. Otherwise, it's a manual process and has to go through the accounting system. And again, that's all built into this orchestration. So that observation model that I showed you for the orchestration basically says, when does the process start? When does the process end? How long does the equipment provisioning process, part of this overall process, take? How long does the engineer provisioning part take? How long does it take for us to get the PO sent out? And all the kind of information that we might want to know about this process is pushed out. So after I press that button, hopefully, one of my BizTalk servers processed that message. And it wasn't this one. I don't know which one it is because it's indeterminate. It was this one. And if we double click on this XML file, this is an invoice. And if you look at it, you notice, I close the nice information dialog. Notice that it's actually out of fact. So the concept is, BizTalk R2 enables WCF, but it also integrates with EDI. And if we have this partner relationship where we can send a direct invoice, what if that conglomerate is a European conglomerate and we need to send them an invoice and they demand that it be in EDI format. So this is the EDI XML format, but we can easily transform that into the actual text-based EDI format and send that to our partner. So that's the overall scenario. Now, if we go back and look at the orchestration here, notice that we're calling, and I mentioned a couple of different services. So there's a few services that we're calling during this process, and these services are implemented with WCF. So all of our back-end services, the equipment service and the PO service and all the things that we need in our infrastructure that aren't part of BizTalk, but we need to call from BizTalk, have all been written with WCF. And we're integrating with them using the WCF adapter in R2. Now, this is where we get into the actual sort of focus of my talk, which is, BAM is great for business users, but if I've got, multi-machine BizTalk installations, if I've got web farms that are running my WCF services, if I'm building out this service-oriented architecture, deploying this out into my infrastructure, how do I know what's going on inside of those services? Okay? Now with BizTalk, if I've got BizTalk services, obviously I can go into the MMC and the group hub page, and it's going to give me some idea what's happening with my services inside of BizTalk. WCF is a framework. It's not a product. WCF has no, inherent information that it can necessarily give me. Now, there is WCF logging. You can turn on WCF logging. WCF logging is nice and verbose and gives you lots and lots of information. What's hard sometimes is to find the tree that you want inside of the forest of information that WCF gives you, right? And it's all very low-level, SOAP messaging kind of information. Now, you can set WCF to log things in local event logs, but again, then you're going to have to use some tool like MOM to scour those event logs. Again, with WCF, there is no sort of out-of-box infrastructure for managing services, okay, so for knowing what's going on. So with R2, they included 2 new interceptors, right? Again, 2004, we had an interceptor for orchestrations. 2006, they added an interceptor for BizTalk messaging, so we could declaratively apply our BAM infrastructure to messaging in BizTalk. In R2, they added an interceptor for Windows Workflow Foundation, for WF, and for Windows Communication Foundation, WCF. So with WF, if we're using Windows workflows in parts of our application, we can add what's called the BAM tracking service, which plugs into the WF workflows tracking infrastructure, which is pretty similar to the kind of thing I talked about with BAM and the orchestration interceptor, right? It's a way of saying, here's my workflow model, here's the data that I want to have come out of my workflow model. That's called a tracking profile in WF. And then we install a tracking service which can take that data and do something with it. And then in the case of the BAM tracking service, which is the interceptor layer for WF, it pushes it into BAM. They also have the WCF interceptor. The WCF interceptor plugs in as an endpoint extension, which is one of the extensibility points in WCF. You configure it on your endpoint, and when you configure it on your endpoint, it installs a message inspector and parameter inspector. You take the configuration, and when it finds a match in terms of an event that's of interest to you, based upon your configuration, it's going to pump that data into BAM. Now again, with the WCF and WF interceptors, one of the key things to keep in mind is, once you configure your process to use one of those interceptors, they're going to pull the configuration from the global data store. So again, if I have a web farm where I've got 5 or 6 different WCF services all running on my 5 web farmed machines, if I want to change the observation model, if I want to change the data that's going to go into BAM from those WCF endpoints, I go to my global BAM configuration tool, I deploy a new interceptor configuration, the interceptor will pick up that the interceptor configuration has changed without me recompiling anything, without me restarting anything. Now, if I wanted to force the configuration right now, I would have to shut down all my app domains and restart all my app domains. But if I'm okay with it taking a few seconds for the interceptor configuration to pick up, I can go ahead and deploy that globally. So it gives me a way of creating a configuration-based tracking system in WCF. And I can decide what comes out. Now again, I might use this from a business point of view, right? For my WCF services, maybe I want to know, order amounts. Maybe I want to know, geographical locations of those orders if I'm doing orders, right? That's perfectly fine. What I'm talking about this morning specifically is, what if I want to use it for operational data? What if I want to use it for how many times a day is this operation being called? How many times a day is the operation successful? How many times a day does the operation cause a fault? How long does it take for each of these operations to be called? And then you start talking about the BAM aggregation infrastructure, where you can start aggregating all that data and you can start getting information about all your services. So you can get, this service, how many requests are happening today? What was the average execution time? And you can get sort of an idea of the health of your services. And again, the idea of services are autonomous. So basically by using this configuration system, this aspect-oriented tracking, we're not breaking that autonomous nature of those services. We're just instrumenting each of them into a common store, okay? So that's what I'm going to show you. Now here is the observation model that I've created. The observation model, and now this is the BAM activity after it's been exported from Excel into the XML format. You notice it's just a list of checkpoints, data types. Each data type has an ID, which is essentially a GUID, and then the name. So what do I want to know? I want to know the name of the operation. I want to know the status. Did it execute well? Did it execute poorly? Did it cause a fault? I want to know how long it took. I want to know the time that the operation started, and I want to know the time the operation ended. Now, this is just a simple example of the kind of thing that I'm talking about you can do with this interceptor in R2 with WCF. And I've also created a view on top of it so I can see the aggregations on top of it, et cetera, et cetera. So this is my observation model, right? This is the data that I want to know for my services. Now what I have to do is I have to create the interceptor configuration, okay? Now here's where I'm going to kind of come close and talk to you guys, person to person, not sort of as speaker, but more as like developer to developer. Now, what did I say earlier was probably the #1 reason why people don't use BAM? The tooling, right? The tooling. Tooling wasn't great, okay? Now, for R2, they came out with these 2 new cool interceptors, WCF and WF. They did some improvements in the runtime, the Excel 2007. What would be great if we had a very similar kind of tool for the WCF and WF interceptors as we have for BizTalk, right? A visual tool where we could say, here's the observation model, here's how I want my process to map to that observation model, and a button that would say, deploy. Unfortunately, they did not give us that, okay? They said, okay, well, we're going to give you this infrastructure. You have to create the XML configuration files yourself, okay? So you have to create the interceptor config by hand using your XML editor of choice. Okay, my XML editor of choice is Visual Studio. So this is not good, right? My typical phrase that I use is, this just sucks, right? It just, it's not, honestly, right? I'm not from Microsoft, and I can say, and I've told them this to their faces, right? So I'm not worried about this being on DVD and, me getting, hauled off to Microsoft jail or anything. Not good, right? Bad move, right? Should have invested in the tooling. They did invest in the tooling. That's the end of what I'm going to say about it. If you see me later today, buy me a beer, and I'll go on and on and on about how horrible I think it is that they didn't build a tool. But for now, we're just going to put that aside, right? Take a deep breath. Okay, it's okay that they didn't build a tool. So what am I going to do? I'm going to go create an XML configuration file. Now, there are a couple things you can do to make this less painful. The first thing that you can do is take the BAM schemas for the interceptor configuration and put them in a special folder. And this is just a feature that's built into Visual Studio. I happen to be using Visual Studio 2008. So if I go into Visual Studio 9, and Visual Studio 2005 has this same facility, if I go to XML, there's a folder called schemas. If you drop an XML schema into this folder, Visual Studio, whenever you have an XML file, will automatically pick up on that schema and give you schema validation. So there are 3 schemas for BAM. If I look at date modified, oh, here they are. So here's the common interceptor, here's the WCF interceptor, and there's the workflow interceptor schemas. So I put these files into that folder, and this is all documented in the BizTalk help. So that's going to make it a little bit easier for me to be able to edit these configuration files. So in fact, if I go into Visual Studio, back to my XML file, I can say, interceptor configuration, which is the root element. I can say XML namespace, BAM, equals, and it actually pulls up a list of the namespace URIs. So I can just go down and say, BAM interceptor configuration, and if I go ahead and put BAM here, notice it has IntelliSense for me. If I put BAM here, notice it says, this element is not valid against the schema. It has incomplete content. You need at least one of these event source elements inside of this file. So that helps a little bit, right? It helps a little bit to say, here's these well-formed schemas that are well done. Put them in your Visual Studio folder, or again, other XML editors have the same facility. It's not just Visual Studio. If you use XML Spy or any of those other tools, they have that as well. And when you're editing these XML configuration files, we'll give you schema IntelliSense, right? So we'll give you the ability to say, BAM, event source. We'll give you the attributes and the elements as IntelliSense, and we'll do validation. Okay, that helps a little bit. Now, the other thing that I like to use is I like to use snippets. Okay. Oh wow, don't know what's happening there. All right, is beta. So I like to use snippets. How many people use snippets in their Visual Studio code development? Not enough people. Okay, everybody should use snippets. So there's snippets in whatever language you happen to code in. If you code in C#, for example, let me go into some C# here. And just as an example as well, here's the service that I'm going to instrument. And here is my imperative logging, right? So I've got this imperative logging where at the beginning of my method, I'm logging something. At the end of my method, I'm logging something. And I've got a try-catch block. And if I have an exception, I'm going to log that exception. But again, this requires a lot of manual coding on my part, error-prone. If I have to change it, I have to recompile it, yada, 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 right? We talked about that earlier. Back to snippets. So in snippets, you can say, basically, let's say I was going to write out to the console here, if I had a console. I can say CW tab tab. That's going to expand console.writeLine. That's one of the snippets that's built into the C# language in Visual Studio. Another useful one is properties. So if I wanted a property on this class, I could say prop tab tab, and it would create a property for me. And I have this essentially tokens I can cycle through with the tab key. And if I want to change this to string, I can tab and change that to string. And I can change the name, right? And when I'm done, I can press escape. So snippets are really, really useful. They're in C# and VB.NET. They're also in the XML editor in Visual Studio. So if I go to the XML editor, again, for my interceptor configuration, I can do Control-KX, which is the command, the keyboard command for bringing up snippets. I could go to my XML snippet, and I can say, I want a BAM interceptor configuration. So it drops in the root element, it puts in all the right namespaces, it has an event source, and notice I can tab through and say, here's the type, here's the name, and here's the technology, right? So I know that the technology is going to be WCF. I know that the name is going to be the name of my service contract. So that's actually contracts.iposervice, comma, contracts, comma, version equals 1.0.00, comma, culture equals neutral, comma, public key token equals null. And I can say my event source, oops, I pressed escape and said tab, and my event source can be, my PO service. Okay, that'll be the name of the event source. Okay, and you just go step by step and create additional items. Notice that the schema editor or the schema validation is saying you have an incomplete list of content. You need at least BAM activity. So I'll put in BAM activity. Oh, not inside of event source, sorry. Outside of event source. BAM activity. And the name of the activity, well, the name of the activity is service metrics, right? How do I know the name of the activity is service metrics, right? There's the XML. Right? The XML from my BAM activity says the name of your activity is service metrics. And so that was what I link in that interceptor configuration. So if I was going to analogize this to the tracking profile editor, at this point, I've pulled up the BAM activity and I've got the tree view. I've pulled up my service and I've got my designer. Of course, I don't have either of those, right? I just have to pretend that I have those. But I actually think that that's a useful thing to do. I mean, pretending in general, right, is useful. But pretending for this is useful in terms of conceptually understanding what you're doing. Remember when we were in the tracking profile editor, we said, here's our activity, and here's the things that are happening, and we drag and drop them over. We're going to do really the same thing here. We just have to hand code it in XML, which makes it a little bit less fun. But conceptually, we're doing the exact same thing. So I could go through and I could configure the rest of this activity. I could stay here for the next couple of hours and hand type all this XML. Not a very fun demo. Obviously, I have a finished version of that configuration. But I just wanted to give you a flavor of what we have to do here. Now, to add to that flavor of what we have to do, there's the last thing that I have to tell you about in terms of what we've got here. We've got this interceptor configuration. Remember, we say, here's our activity and here's what we want to do. And we have to tell the BAM interceptor how to know when something happens inside of my WCF endpoint that this is an interesting event, that this is something that they want to instrument using BAM. Now, the way I do that is I have to give the BAM interceptor an expression that they can evaluate. If I was going to describe a sample expression using just the English language, I might say, when the service operation getPO decision is called, please update the BAM activity service metrics with operation start, a date time value, and the name of the operation, please. When the operation completes, could you please update the operation end? And if the operation faults, could you please log that the operation failed and what time that it failed? That would be an example of the kind of expression that I'd be giving the BAM interceptor. So the interceptor would be looking at what's happening inside of that endpoint. If it matches one of those expressions, it's going to do the thing that I tell it to do. When we write these expressions, we have to write them in XML. Now, if you were going to build something that parsed an expression, you'd have the choice of, A, do I make it easy for people to write expressions in my expression language? B, do I make it easy for me to parse those expressions that are written in my expression language? Guess, A or B, which the BAM team chose. Considering their history, B, right? They chose a expression language that made it easy for them to parse. That expression language is an XML schema, essentially, that's built around reverse Polish notation expressions. Okay? How many people had a HP reverse Polish notation calculator at some point? Fair number of you, right? So you've all been there. The slides have an example of reverse Polish notation. Again, I'm not going to go into a lot of details, and I'm not going to rant about reverse Polish notation here. I can do that later, again, if you want to buy me a beer. Here's an example of the interceptor configuration. So here's one of those expressions. And the expression says, hey, this is a service request, and the operation name equals getPO decision. Both of those things are true, right? So it's service contract call point equals, or service request equals, get operation name, getPO decision equals, and. So it ands those two mini expressions together into one larger expression. Yeah, reverse Polish notation, right? Okay, so not necessarily good. So what do I have to do to make this actually work? Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my XML files that I've got created, and I'm going to grab my WCF new configuration file and my service configuration file. These are the two XML files that I want. I'm going to copy those to my main BizTalk server, just through a network share here. And I'm going to go out to that server, which is 201. I'm going to go to a command prompt. And this is where I get to use the other tool in BAM, which is called BM, bammanagement.exe. Okay? And I'm going to say BM deploy all definition file c:\service.xml. Right? So what I'm doing here is I'm saying, here is the activity and my views that I want you to create an infrastructure to be able to store data for those activity instances. So it's going out and it's creating the database, it's creating the views, it's creating the stored procedures, it's creating the alert functionality, it's creating the SSIS packages for the views. So it's doing all that piece by piece. And once it's all done, I've deployed my event observation model. That's pretty fast. That's pretty good. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to say BM deploy interceptor, file name is c:\wcf new.xml. So this is the interceptor configuration, okay? So those are two steps you have to do. You have to deploy your BAM activity, right? Everything's based upon the BAM activity. I have to deploy my interceptor configuration file globally. And now what I can do is I can go out and I can configure my endpoints, okay? I'm going to configure my endpoints by going to the web config file because this is a WCF service that's hosted inside of IIS. Here's my service endpoint configuration. So what I'm going to do is under the behaviors configuration element in WCF, I'm going to say I want a new BAM behavior extension or a behavior for an endpoint that includes the BAM extension. And I've got a snippet for that as well. So BAM behavior usage. So it drops in a behavior with a name, uses the BAM endpoint behavior extension element, which pulls in that behavior that deploys the interceptor inside of my WCF endpoint. And then I just have to specify the data source. So I have to put in the right server, which is 168.0.201, right? That's my BAM server. So I have to point the connection string at that server. And then I specify what my polling interval is. And remember I said the BAM interceptor will poll its configuration database for new interceptor configuration based upon this interval. So I've set it to every 5 seconds, which is pretty fast, but it's good for a demo. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and say, go to this folder, grab this web.config file, and then go drop it into the web config root for both of those other servers. So there's 203 and 202, copy and replace, okay? And so what should happen, right? And let me just go, make sure that my service is up and I didn't mess up my configuration. So I'm just going to go ahead and hit the local host just to make sure that that service comes up. So this is the machine, one of my machines where that service is running. And again, I've got a mini cluster web config, a web farm kind of setup, right? So I've got multiple machines that might get invoked, that particular service might get invoked on either of those two machines, depending on how the BizTalk processing happens to be going on. Well, that's taking a long time. Let's make sure this is working. While that is still thinking, let me go ahead and make a new reservation. Okay, so I'll just pick, I don't know, any studio. I don't really care. Some equipment, some engineer. Click to reserve. Click to confirm. Okay, so it says, thank you. Your reservation has been accepted. Let's go ahead and see if this is working. That PO service is working. Okay, so what should happen in a couple of seconds, and again, I've got a couple of machines here, so I don't know which machine is going to pick up the request. I don't know which machine is actually going to execute the web service request. So we can't see that, but what we should see is another invoice go out. So that should be our indication that the process succeeded. But then what we should be able to do is we should go back to SQL Server. And again, I like to show this. I like to show this way more than I like to show the BAM portal. If I go to my BAM primary import database, notice I've already got open a view. The view is my booking view, the one that I applied through the interceptor configuration for BizTalk orchestrations. But if I go ahead and refresh my management studio, notice that it's created a number of more views, including one called service metrics. And here's active instances and completed instances. And so if I open this view, and if my demo is working, I should see some data there. But I don't. So let's figure out what's happening. So there's no invoice there. There is an invoice there. Oh, you know what I did? My bad. Let's go back here. I know exactly what I did. Is I did the classic mistake with WCF, which is to create the behavior element, but not to link it back to the endpoint, right? So I have to go and say the behavior configuration for this endpoint is the BAM endpoint behavior. That's what I did wrong. So let's go ahead and fix that. So grab the web.config again. Go ahead and drop it in both of those places. Now, of course, you'd only have to do this once, right? Once you get the configuration set up for a particular endpoint, you'd only have to do this step once, okay? Let's go ahead and make another reservation. Click to confirm. It says thank you. Let's go back to the SQL server. And let's hope that everything is working. Give it another second. There's no invoice there. No invoice there yet. Let's delete that one just so that we know that was processed. There's 202, there's 203. Not looking great. There's no errors there, though. That's good. How about 202? Any errors on 202? There was an Xlang's error. Yeah, if you make a mistake in your XML file, it'll tell you when you deploy. So if I had a mistake in my configuration, it would have told me when I tried to deploy. Oh man, I had this all. So this is the problem with having the multi-machine install, right? I don't know exactly which machine executed that request. That's 12. No, that was 1204. It's 2. So that's old. Probably what I am is I'm just impatient and I need to wait for a second. Well, let's look one more time at BizTalk. Of course, this is the whole advantage of having BizTalk, right, is to be able to go in and say what's happening globally. So let's go ahead and look at our group hub and see what's happening globally. Oops. While I'm doing that, any questions? Yeah, go ahead. Yes. Uh-huh. Yes. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes. So yeah, so the BAM API is available, and there's a slide on that in the slides. The question is, are there times where I have to use the BAM API? And the answer is yes. A declarative would be the preferred solution. The tracking profile editor or the interceptor configuration for WCF or WF would be the preferred solution. But in the cases where that doesn't work, and there are a couple of times where that doesn't work, you might have to do it with code. But that would be my least preferred way of doing it, right? I would prefer to do it with, declaratively. So let me just double check. It seems like actually everything's running. Oh, no. There's 210. So BAM management seems to work. Let me go back. Let me just double check to see that this service is still working. There's no invoices on that machine. There's no invoices on that machine. Boy, that's really no fun. Oh yeah, there's no actual logic behind the scenes that does that. So that would make demos more hard, right? If there was actually logic making sure the engineers were actually, we basically can provision any of them at any time, right? Yeah, something's going wrong. That's not good. So 203 doesn't look like it's doing anything. 202, it doesn't look like it's doing anything either. Well, that's just horrible. I had this nice multi-machine BizTalk installation and everything was working, and there we go, right? This has been the worst week as far as I can tell for people in demos, right? Have you guys noticed this? everybody's having problems with their demos. And they said, make sure your demos work. I was here at 7:45. The demo was all working. I ran through it. Everything was working. And now I've done something incredibly wrong, and there's no data coming into BAM. Ah, yay! There we go. I'm also impatient. If you've ever seen me talk before, I'm often impatient. And what I just needed to do is I just needed to wait for a second. So there you can see that that service endpoint is now pushing data into BAM through that declarative interceptor configuration. It's a great way to end the talk. The demo worked. What are the advantages of this? I've talked about the advantages over and over during the talk. I can talk about another one, which is, what if I want to do the same thing with my BizTalk WCF endpoints? Well, inside of BizTalk, what I could do is I could go to my send port. I could go to the send port that I'm sending that message, and the interceptor can also be configured to be used on a client. And a send port is basically a WCF client. So I can go ahead and add the BAM behavior extension to my send port, and it can also use the interceptor configuration. So I can deploy an interceptor configuration for my BizTalk WCF endpoints. There are more and more products that are coming from Microsoft which use WCF. Some of those you'll be able to apply the BAM interceptor to those endpoints even if you didn't write them, okay? Because it's just a matter of configuration and configuring the BAM behavior. So I think this form of tracking, whether you talk about it from a business point of view or from an operational point of view, is going to become more and more important. And as the gentleman asked, well, what if I have to write code? Of course, there are times when the imperative model is the way you have to do it. You can use an imperative model with BAM. It has an API. You can get the slides from the TechEd website, and there is an example of the API there. But again, prefer the configuration, because all I'd have to do to change this now is redeploy my interceptor configuration. All of my services, all of my endpoints on any of my machines that are configured with this BAM infrastructure would pick up that new configuration and start pushing data in. I could turn the configuration off, I could turn it on, I could add to it, I could subtract from it, and it would allow me to do that all declaratively without having to go and recompile anything, without having to redeploy anything, without having to reconfigure anything except for the global BAM configuration store, okay? So again, thank you guys so much for coming out early on Friday morning. I appreciate it. Thank you for staying to see that the demo actually did work. So again, please fill out your evaluations. Also, again, if you want to get a t-shirt, a Silverlight t-shirt, go down to the Pluralsight booth and say BAM, and hopefully they have enough for everybody that comes. And have a good Friday and a safe journey home, wherever your home is. Okay? Thank you.